Hi. The work I'm presenting today is the culmination of a large effort over many, many years. In particular, I want to thank the people circled in red, and I'll try and name check some of them as I go along. Some of the great debates in continental tectonics include the degree to which plates act as blocks in the continents versus act as a continuum, the importance of internal forces from gravitational potential energy, and the degree to which strain rates vary during the earthquake cycle. Deformation of the Tibetan Plateau has long been the testing ground for these ideas. We derive in this presentation a new high-resolution velocity field for Tibet and discuss the implications. Our workflow for deriving this velocity field is first to make interferograms using the COMET LIXAR system, to invert those for line-of-sight velocities using LIXPAS, and then we invert simultaneously INSAR and GNSS for reference frame adjustments to tie the INSAR into the Eurasian reference frame, and also solving at the same time for 3D velocity and strain rate fields. Just a little bit more detail. When we make our interferograms, we do that automatically for a series of frames, most of which are 250 by 250 kilometers wide, using the LIXAR system processed at the UK Jasmine Cedar facility. And there are more details in this paper by Milan Lazecki and a presentation at this meeting. To date, there are 663,000 interferograms that are available for download from our website, which is about a 50% increase since 2020. And there's a link there. You can go and download all those data and use them for your own applications. If we look at the coherence across the Alpine Himalayan belt, you can plot things like this, the average coherence, which is really spectacular. If we zoom in on the Tibetan Plateau, you can see we've got pretty good coherence for most of Tibet. The coherence is slightly worse in the east, where there's a bit more vegetation. It's poor where there's very high snow cover in the winter. We take all of those interferograms and we invert them for line-of-sight velocities using the LIXPAS approach, which you can read about in this paper by Yu Morishita. We calculate velocities at 1 kilometer resolution across the whole plateau over a total of 172 frames. And for each of those, we remove the long wavelength quadratic ramps. The time span typically is more than 5 years now for Sentinel data that we have processed for most of those frames. If we look at those line of sight velocities without the ramps removed, you can see many of them do have long wavelength ramps. But if we remove those, what we get is a relatively low amount of variance in each individual frame and some systematic signals that seem to cut across between multiple frames. We see that also in the descending data set. The next stage is to invert for INSAR and GNSS to find simultaneously reference frame adjustments and the 3D velocity and strain rate fields. We do that by jointly inverting the GNSS and INSAR data using the VELMAP approach. This solves for velocities of the nodes in a mesh of spherical triangles with 0.25 degree spacing in this case, and we also solve for those reference frame adjustment parameters of the INSAR data. This is a map of the mesh that we're using for Tibet. The GNSS comes from a compilation from Chris Rollins, which includes the Wang and Shen 2020 compilation for China. Once we've done that, we get out our INSAR velocities in a Eurasian reference frame, and here they are. They look rather beautiful. You can see a systematic set of ascending and descending velocities showing the largely horizontal movements of the Tibetan Plateau. For the ascending data, the signals are movement away from the satellite, so a gradual increase in red for as you go from west to east, and the opposite in the descending. So you've got gradual increasing range decrease as you move from west to east across the plateau. The model predicts, this is the model projected into the line of sight from the velocities on the nose of that mesh that I showed you earlier, and these are the residuals, so the model fits the data rather nicely. And we can look at those velocities as a continuous velocity field. Here we've got the eastern vertical velocities that are largely what's being constrained by the INSAR data. the northward velocity is largely coming from the GNSS. If you look at the GNSS only, you can see that that doesn't have any information on the vertical velocities. We're only using horizontal velocities here. All the vertical information is coming from the INSAR. The horizontals are also slightly less sharp for the GNSS data. We can also look at the strain rates, and here you've got the different components of the strain rate tensor, and also some derived products, the maximum shear strain rate here, and the second invariant of the strain rate on the right. And you can see again some really nice features of the tectonics brought out in these strain rate models. If we focus in on the dilatation of the plateau, what you can see is that the highest elevations, if I just bring in the 4,750 meter contour, the highest elevations of the plateau are increasing in their surface area. So there's a competition between north-south contraction and east-west extension, and for the highest elevations, the east-west extension is winning, and that's telling us about the importance of gravitational potential energy as one of the driving forces for these areas of exceptionally thick crust in Tibet. Once we have that velocity field, we can also calculate the east-west and vertical displacements more directly from the ascending and descending mosaics at the INSAR resolution by assuming that the northward velocities from the velocity field are correct following the approach in Wright et al. 2004. So we take those two velocity fields and then we can invert for the eastward velocity field, which rather beautifully again shows the eastward tectonics of Tibet, a number of really interesting features that I'll describe shortly in this data set. We can also calculate the vertical velocities in this approach, and you can see there are also some systematic long wavelength and short wavelength patterns in the vertical velocities. I think these are a little bit harder to interpret, and I think some of these are potentially environmental effects, perhaps associated with permafrost or some of the phase bias signals that you'll hear about in other presentations, for example, from Yasser Magsudi at this meeting. So I'm going to focus on the horizontals. We can also calculate the maximum shear strain directly from those horizontal velocity fields. This is a figure created by Ji Yu using a method she's going to describe later in this session, but you can see it really sharply identifies the location of the faults, some of the major faults here, in particular the Kunlun fault, the Altin-Tag fault, which you can see nicely branching here, and also the Haiwan fault here. If we just focus in on those eastward velocities, and we can have a look at some profiles through different sections of the data set. First of all, in all of these profiles, the grey dots are profiles of the eastward velocity within a plus or minus 75 kilometer swath of the red line shown below. The red dash is the eastward velocity from the VELMAP velocity field, and the blue error bars show the GPS velocities, again within a plus or minus 75 kilometer swath. What you can see in many of these profiles, and I'm not going to show you them all, but in many of them we see strain concentrations associated with some of the major faults. For example, here associated with the Zhangzhuhe fault and around the Haiwan fault, actually slightly to the north of the main strand there. If we look at the Altin-Tag, here's a section where we don't have GPS on both sides, but again you see a change in velocity as you go across the fault. Even the Karakoram fault, which is going at a relatively slow rate, you can see there's around a couple of millimeters a year of step in the eastward velocity across that fault, but again it's focused within a relatively sharp region around that fault. We also see ongoing post-seismic deformation associated with large earthquakes, most prominently on the Kunlun fault, where we see this very prominent step in the velocities associated, I think, largely with the post-seismic signal that's ongoing after the Kokoxili earthquake in 2001. We also see the same signal in an area where we don't have GPS, again demonstrating the value added by the INSAR in this velocity field. This is through the center of that of that earthquake, and again we've got around 15 millimeters still peak to peak of velocity there, so almost certainly an accelerated rate that we're still seeing. We can also still see a step of probably accelerated velocities associated with the Manyi fault, where there was a magnitude 7.4 earthquake in 1997. If we look at longer profiles such as this one, what we see is systematic long wavelength signals, potentially modulated with steps associated with some of the faults, although not necessarily with all of them. Similarly, if we look at this profile across the grabens in southern Tibet, we also see this systematic long wavelength trend, potentially with some strain localization along some of the grabens, but again, by no means across all of them. A popular way of modeling continental deformation is to use so-called block models. These are essentially models in which you break up the crust into individual mini tectonic plates. They're allowed to rotate and translate with strain accumulating along some of the boundaries. Richard Styron has taken our velocity field and ingested it into his latest block model for the Tibetan region, which has 120 blocks. Those blocks have boundaries, some of which are coincident with active faults marked in black here, and others where there aren't individual faults mapped along those boundaries. He's used it alongside quaternary slip rates to give and calculate and estimate the slip rates on the major faults. Of course, the major assumption here is that there's no deformation in the block interiors. So I think that in some cases leads to overestimates of the slip rates. For example, as we saw in the profile across the Karakoram fault, I don't believe there's really 6 millimeters of slip per year on the Karakoram fault, but it's the block model is forcing all the deformation to localize onto the structures that exist in it. But what these models do is give you a sense of how individual faults can accommodate that broader scale deformation field and gives you an estimate of those rates, which is useful for seismic hazard. So if we return to the questions I said at the beginning, so does the deformation field that we see look like plates or a continuum? Well, I think it looks like a continuum modulated by major faults where you've got higher strain rates. So clearly there are long wavelength features here that are controlled by the dynamics, but faults are clearly important in what the present day velocity field looks like. The clear association of dilatation with the highest elevation demonstrates, I think, the importance of internal buoyancy forces in continental tectonics. And we see very clearly that there are post-seismic strain transients that persist for at least 20 years following some of the major earthquakes in Tibet. And I think this is a really important thing that we need to do further work on to try and understand and disentangle transient components of the geodetic velocity field, particularly if we're going to use these static 5-year estimates of present day velocities to try and say something about long-term seismic hazard. So thank you very much for your attention. I just want to end by listing a number of presentations at this meeting where you can hear more about different aspects of the Comet LIXAR system, which I encourage you to go online and have a play with and attend as many of these as you can. So thank you very much.